Rick's List, CNN weekday afternoons, 3 Eastern.
We are drilling down more on our top story of the day. The video alone suggests that these guys are real serious. You see camouflage uniforms, you see tight formations, arms and ammunition. 9 members of this Messianic Christian militia now have been charged. 8 of the 9 were captured in raids in southern Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. They're alleged targets, local, state, and federal law enforcement officials. The feds moved in because they seem to have been worried that someone out there was about to get hurt. Susan Candiani is joining me here on the set. Mark Potok is joining me now from Montgomery, Alabama. Both of them are going to take us through this. Susan, let me just begin with you before I go to Mark. I think the thing that's most alarming about this story, because we've heard about people like this in the past, but part of their plan, according to the indictment, was that they would kill a police officer, or hope to kill a police officer, and then when other police officers came to that police officer's funeral or procession, then they would use that as an opportunity to kill more police officers. That's crazy.
Well, it's certainly, talk about creating an opportunity to take people out. Clearly, the government says there was just this was a hate group, pure and utter hatred for the government as an entity, it is alleged, and for law enforcement officers of any ilk wearing a badge and a uniform, then they go after you.
But I don't understand, Mark, there's a term for, the average police officer in some small town somewhere. They call them local yokels. What's a local yokel have to do with somebody's hate for Washington, D.C. or the federal government? How do they put that together in their minds?
I cannot answer the question, because the reality is that most of these militia groups, of course, do identify the federal government as the real enemy, as the kind of evil entity out there. And federal law enforcement agents of all kinds have been subjects of attacks going all the way back to the 90s. But this idea of killing anyone with a badge, your local police officer, and all with the idea of drawing hundreds of law enforcement officials from around the country and then launching this attack using IEDs and missiles is just, beggars the imagination.
You know about every one of these folks who does this kind of thing all over the country. You guys keep a list, you compartmentalize them. Is this as bad as you've seen in a long time? Where would you rate these guys?
I think it's one of the worst half dozen or perhaps dozen things I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years, at least in terms of what their intent was. We saw plats back in the 1990s that contemplated the deaths of 30,000 people. But, you think a little bit about what this might really have looked like. I've been to police funerals, and they're typically attended by hundreds and hundreds of police officers, all carrying sidearms, of course. So, one can only imagine what kind of sort of Armageddon they thought they were going to create.
And Mark, you've been looking at groups like these for the past 15 years, going way back to, let's say, the Oklahoma City bombing, the siege at Waco, this kind of thing. And then we didn't hear much about them for a while, these militias. Now we seem to be doing that again. Why do you think? What's driving this?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely true that the militias basically peaked in 1996, declined over the next 7 or 8 years, and have been essentially quiescent ever since then, although there were a few still out there. And we just saw an enormous explosion in just the last 12 or 18 months.
So is this a resurgence, and why?
Well, I think the factors that are driving this are a non-white president in a country that is very unused to that, all that represents in terms of demographic change, real anger about the state of the economy, also real anger and frustration about the way the government has dealt with the state of the economy, and in particular things like, multi-million-dollar bonuses for the same bankers who arguably drove the economy into the ground and the rest of it. I think on top of that, it's really important to say that there's been a lot of mainstream pushing of very radical ideas by politicians and some commentators. So, when politicians talk about Obama as a fascist, as a socialist, as a man who is setting up death panels or political re-education camps for our children, some people take that kind of rhetoric literally and act.
But what about the religious aspect of all this, that component? What would drive a group like this talking about fear of the Antichrist and the end times, and what does that have to do with this apparent hatred of the federal government?
Well, I think these things have gotten all mixed up. So what I mean is that the patriot groups, the militia groups of the 90s and later, were all about the federal government as an evil actor, and really what the government was seen to be doing was ushering in a kind of socialistic one world government which would rob us of all our freedoms and so on. This is sort of the Christian millennial twist, where they're, of course, looking right at the book of Revelations and describing the one world government as something very similar, but this is the one world government that will be run by Satan. Really, when you look at the ideologies, they're very similar, and it's worth remembering that many militiamen refer to themselves as Christian patriots, so there's a strong element of that in the movement.
Well, I'm a Christian, but I'm not crazy, and it seems to me that these folks are crazy.
I think there's something to be said for that.
Let me ask you a question about what you just said about commentators. I just heard you say that something about the rhetoric from some commentators may be causing some of this. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that when you have people going on the air saying, as for instance Glenn Beck has on Fox News, suggesting that it is very possible that the Federal Emergency Management Agency is running a secret set of concentration camps, even though Beck, in his fourth show finally decides this isn't true, because he has a huge number of listeners, some portion of that listenership, of that audience, actually believes these tall tales, these fairy tales. And the same could be said of many other commentators, people who've talked about Latino immigrants bringing leprosy to this country, your own former colleague, Lou Dobbs. It's that kind of thing, but these things have been said by very many politicians as well, and what we have not seen are responsible, or so-called responsible leaders of the parties, and in particular the Republican Party, where much of this has come from, essentially calling their colleagues out on these kinds of matters.
Point
I understand
well made.
that John Boehner last week did, but it was kind of a day late and a dollar short.
Point well made. And obviously, there's a certain tendency when you hear that to believe that there's a generalization there. And I've known you long enough to say that there are plenty of quality, smart, well-prepared talk show hosts from the right who are very conservative but still do not preach this kind of language and do not use that kind of rhetoric, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I don't mean to defame either conservatives or liberals at all. These are certain individuals, but the nature of the media market seems to have propelled them forward, at least in some instances.
Okay, we do that for explanatory purposes because we know that the broad brush example will often be used when people talk about these things, but it's an important conversation, certainly an important conversation to be had on a day like this when we have this kind of news. Mark Potok, our thanks to you for being with us. Keep up the good work, and Susan, my thanks to you as well. Appreciate it.